It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air carries just a touch of frost and the leaves crunch underfoot. Thomas Weller loved mornings like this, quiet and alive with possibility. At 52, he found peace in nature, a stark contrast to the chaos of his work life in the bustling city. His weekends were his sanctuary, and his favorite refuge was the sprawling woods near his small country home. On this particular Saturday, Thomas decided he'd go hunting. Not for sport, he never saw the appeal in shooting for trophies, but for food. He'd scouted these woods for years, an amateur hunter who respected the land and the creatures living within it. His trips often ended with a modest prize, a grouse, a rabbit, occasionally a deer if luck decided to favor him. The woods were familiar, his trusted companion, but as Thomas left his house that morning, he had no idea it would be the last time. He packed light, his rifle, a few rounds of ammunition, some water, and a flashlight, and set out as the sun began slicing through the mist that clung to the trees. The forest breathed around him, alive in a way only nature can be. Birds called distantly, squirrels scurried through the underbrush, and the scent of damp earth filled his lungs. Thomas felt at ease, his steps steady but unhurried. Hours ticked by as he carefully searched for signs of game, stepping over roots and streams as he ventured deeper into the woods. His mind wandered to thoughts of his two young grandchildren, who loved to hear his tall tales of hunting adventures. He couldn't wait to share the story of whatever he brought home today. He smiled to himself, imagining the wide-eyed wonder on their faces. But what happened next wasn't the kind of story anyone could prepare for. It began subtly, a faint rustle in the underbrush. At first, Thomas assumed it was a deer. He froze, his breath held as his fingers gripped the rifle tighter. But the rustling grew louder, quicker, almost frantic. His instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He strained his eyes to see through the thicket, but all he caught was a blur of movement. And then it emerged, a wild boar. Thomas's heart jolted at the sight of the beast. It was massive, larger than he had ever imagined a boar could be. Its coarse black hair bristled, and its tusks gleamed sharply in the dappled sunlight. There was a primal intensity in its small, dark eyes, as if it had been watching him long before Thomas had noticed its presence. It grunted, pawing the ground, and then it charged. Thomas reacted instinctively, raising his rifle and firing a shot. The crack of the gun echoed through the trees, startling a flock of birds into flight. But the bullet missed its mark. The boar didn't slow. Its furious squeals pierced the air as it thundered toward him, and Thomas, panic rushing through him, turned to flee. But the forest betrayed him. His foot caught on an exposed root, and he crashed to the ground. The boar was on him in seconds. What followed was chaos, blurred, panicked moments as the animal attacked with savage force. Its tusks tore through his clothing and flesh, and Thomas screamed, calling for help that he knew wouldn't come. The pain was unimaginable, but worse was the fear, the primal terror of being powerless against the raw, brutal force of nature. Thomas fought, kicking and clawing at the creature with every ounce of strength he could muster. His hands scrambled for his rifle, but it lay just out of reach. The boar's rage was unrelenting, its movements fueled by aggression and instinct. Thomas managed to land a desperate punch on its snout, momentarily stunning it, but the reprieve was short-lived. It struck back harder, knocking the wind out of him. When the boar finally retreated, Thomas was left broken, bloodied, and barely breathing. He lay there, his vision blurring as the world tilted around him. The last thing he heard was the sound of the boar crashing away through the underbrush, leaving the forest silent once more. It was a group of hikers who would eventually find him, hours later, when the sunlight had begun to fade. They spotted the rifle first, then saw Thomas lying nearby. One of them, a former paramedic, tried desperately to save him, but it was too late. The attack had been too severe, his injuries too catastrophic. News of his death spread quickly, shaking the small town to its core. Wild boar attacks were rare in the region, almost unheard of, but experts speculated that the animal might have been startled or protecting its young. Thomas had unknowingly wandered into its territory, and nature had responded in the only way it knew how.